Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Hello, my wonderful audience. Hi, I'm really glad to be in touch today. And as always, lately at least, I'm in front of the big glass window. I'm not sure just how big it is. I think it's about 8 feet across and 7 feet deep. I don't know. It's a big window. And I'm just watching the chickadees right now coming and going at the feeders. And we'll have all sorts of flying friends. I tell you more about them during the show, but I get so focused on the show that I don't really look up and see who's flying by. It's the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour. I want to thank a number of you for writing in very supportive notes about my work and what I'm doing. Ann and Deb, Sandy, Jen, very, very supportive. No guys, I don't think. Maybe I missed one or two. But so let me hear for some guys. Let's have some balance. I'm very, very glad that you find the program interesting and useful. There's a tiny division on how much I should bring up politics and how much I should stick to saving the world from psychiatry. I wouldn't mind hearing from you on that and by email, and also on the Open Wednesday, the very last Wednesday of every month. We could talk about a subject like that. How much should I get into politics? It's such a different political view from most folks who might be listening. And how much should I stick to saving the world from psychiatry is the best I can do, which increasingly I have to accept the limits of. But every person we save, every person is a person saved. You know, one of God's children, somebody of equal value to me, to you, and to everyone else. And thank you again just for being there and listening. And thank you, Jess and Alex, too, who work the studio. The show is every Wednesday at 4 p.m. New York time. And the writing to me I'm talking about is Breggin Live at hotmail.com. And you can call in. I hope you'll stay with the subject because we have a great guest, an absolutely marvelous guest in Patrick Hahn, one of my most intelligent, direct, straightforward guests, enlightening guests who always teaches me something. He's been his fourth time on. The number's 888-874-4888. 888-874-4888. And listen live also on 712-775-6850. And there is an app. Go to the App Store to get PRN.FM, Progressive Radio Network, the app. And we have a lot of interesting things. Also the archives, there's an archive and you can just search it for names, or you can just go down it by the chronology or time. And don't forget daily breaking news. Every day there's more news on our website. My assistant Ian, Ginger, my wife, and I, we ask Ian to put stuff up, and he does most of the work, selects most of the things. And there's very interesting stuff, very confirmatory of my warnings. We've put up now a new research study that shows that stimulant drugs do change the brains of children, physically affect them. That's called damage. When something physically affects your brain, it's called harm. We don't know anything that gets in there into the most complex, subtle, poorly understood physical, organic entity in the world, your brain. We don't know how to improve that by fussing around inside it. So that's a really good article to take a look at. And take a look on my YouTube. My YouTube channel. Take a look at the one of my latest 30-minute film about our new organization. We're trying to stop the psychiatric abuse of children. SPAC, Stop the Psychiatric Abuse of Children. And it's a film about a little 30-minute introduction to it. I was interviewed by the Dykes, Melissa, and Aaron, who did the marvelous film, with very heavily involves me, the film that's now been seen by 2 million people at least on the internet, and that's The Minds of Men. So check out what's going on my YouTube. It's one of my largest ways of communicating with the world. Now today, I hope he's on the other end of the line. Patrick Hahn,
right,
are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I'm very, very good. It's a beautiful day here in upstate New York, in Ithaca. And family's doing reasonably well, Patrick. Patrick's last name is H-A-H-N, Hahn, Patrick D. Hahn. And Pat is a professor, kind of an assistant professor in Maryland, and he's a journalist. He's a good writer, freelance writer, and he's got a new book out. And I think this is a very good book. Its name is Madness and Genetic Determinism, Is Mental Illness in Our Genes. But this book is bigger than its title. Bigger than its title. Title's probably pushed on him by the publisher. It was a real good publisher. And it has much more than just about the genetics. Here's chapters 9 forward. Chapter 9, Trauma and Psychosis. Believe it or not, folks, there's a very close correlation between being labeled schizophrenic or manic with psychosis and trauma. Who knew? I knew. Probably most of you knew. But most people don't know, and it's a very good summary. And then he's got a discussion of the asylum era and moral therapy. There once was therapy, usually therapeutic institutions, often conducted by Quakers. Quakers have that wonderful phrase that we should greet that of God in each other. Imagine if you walk around and you just have in your heart greeting that of God in each other. It's about moral therapy, and then Frida Fromm-Reichmann and Chestnut Lodge. Also about Ronald Lang and Kingsley Hall. These are some of the great experiments in psychotherapy. So you see, this book is much, much beyond its title. And then Soteria House and open dialogue therapy. And that Soteria House, my friend Loren, Mosher, psychiatrist, now gone, and R.D. Lang is gone. And open dialogue, which has some modern-day good psychiatrists developing and conducting for a long time now, family-oriented therapy, mostly without drugs. So the book is it's got a lot of good stuff in it. Patrick, let me tell you a story about my going to Chestnut Lodge to give a talk. And then I'm going to unleash you.
I didn't know this. Yeah, go ahead.
It was when I was in D.C., so it's at least 20 years ago, maybe 25. Chestnut Lodge, folks, was the preeminent mental hospital establishment, private, in Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And they did psychotherapy without medication. just about everybody, maybe everybody. They took people off meds. Harry Stack Sullivan was a psychiatrist there. He wrote many books that people don't pay enough attention to anymore, writing about the interpersonal relationship between the patient and the therapist, and also the importance of relationships. Got a little quirky with language at times, but people who do this work and devote their lives to it, they're often interesting people, more interesting than the rest of us. And Frieda Fromm-Reichmann was the therapist who was in the movie and in the book in the movie, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Well, Chestnut Lodge began to deteriorate. That is, it began to find that this just wasn't money-making. I believe that was the most fundamental issue. And they needed to start giving drugs. And I'm sure they were getting a lot of blowback from psychiatry. Psychiatry gets very, very hateful when somebody shows that they're able to help people without drugs.
Yeah, they got sued for not giving a patient drugs.
Well, and that was my next phrase. That's right. That was my next sentence. And somebody got sued. Somebody sued the lodge for not giving them psychiatric drugs. And this became a case that was used to terrify people. Terrify people. And look, if you are an institution and you don't give drugs and your person goes somewhere else and thinks the drugs help them, usually they're not right, but they think the drugs help them, you will get sued. Now, as far as I recall, that suit failed.
Well, he settled for an undisclosed sum. He settled. They settled out of court.
It was settled out of court. So it was just one more court settlement. It was nothing. I haven't been sued.
But then they started giving more drugs to their patients after that.
So that was a part of it. And are they giving drugs before the suit? To some people?
I don't believe so, nothing that I read said that they were giving anybody drugs before.
Yeah, because my impression was that it was not just the suit. It was that they were failing. They couldn't get enough patients in the new environment, and also they couldn't get enough money. I think was a big part of this. But that would be interesting to go back and study. So they invited me to evaluate a patient for them, and they got permission from the patient to come and do a conference. And my audience, this stuff, you can't make this stuff up. So they sent me some of his records. I said, if I'm going to evaluate this man in a conference, I need every stitch of records you got. Well, okay. And this was after they had already moved away from doing the drugs, although some of the old-timers were still there. I think an old-timer must have invited me. So I got his records, and it showed he'd gone to a local hospital in Washington, D.C. when he was 19, and that he'd been put on antidepressant drugs and become psychotic. Looking at the records, there's no doubt in my mind, and some people suspected it, no doubt at all. So then I went ahead and I scanned the records leading up to now I'm going to see him, and guess what? He's still on antidepressant drugs. I don't remember whether it was a decade later, it was many years later, maybe it was 4 or 5 years later. And I came to the conference and I said, I got a surprise for all of you. This young man at 19 was on antidepressants. He came in the hospital as a non-psychotic 19-year-old struggling with issues. And now here you are, and you still got him on antidepressant drugs, and he's still psychotic. Does this suggest anything? I got stone faces. Nobody wanted to discuss it with me. Can you imagine that? Let's talk about this. Nope. They started asking me other questions. They kept away from discussing these issues. I kept coming back to discuss these issues. And then one of the older men stood up and said, "It is such an irony, such a shame that an outsider is coming us to tell us what we used to believe in." So that's my story from Chestnut Lodge. Is that something?
Oh. Yeah. Yeah, one of the most appalling things, the doctor who sued the Chestnut Lodge, his name was Samuel Osheroff. He was a medical doctor himself, not a psychiatrist, but a medical doctor. And he sued them for not giving him drugs. And what was the most appalling aspect of this was he was there voluntarily. He could have signed himself out and gone home anytime he felt like it. And I think of all the people who've been incarcerated against their will and held down and forcibly injected with drugs and forcibly given electroshock, and none of them ever got to collect a cent.
That's a profound insight, which passed me by. Always good. Yeah. It's always good, Patrick, to have you on the show. That is such a profound insight. And folks, the interesting part is that the official psychiatric community loved this suit because they're just, all they want to do is drug. That's where all the money is. And it's the money in your practice where you can see 5 or 6 patients and collect the medication, the allowance from the insurance companies for medication management. I think they require 15 minutes, I'm not sure, and people fudge to 10 and 8, and they can shove a lot of people in an hour, and they can charge a substantial amount more and make a much better living than they ever could before when a few of them before were doing psychotherapy. And it just knocked psychoanalysis out of the box. And doctors deeply committed to Sigmund Freud and to the understandings given us by Sigmund Freud, which are the truth of life. That's what these guys are like, the old psychoanalysts. Most of them, not all, some of them were decent mensches, decent fellows, but many of them, these arrogant, we have the truth people. Those are the people I was taught by in medical school. One of them lectured on how the truth of Freud, written in 1909, will be as true 100 years from now as it is now. Then I'd go into anatomy class and they'd say, the science of anatomy is really poorly understood, and the anatomy of today will not be the anatomy of tomorrow. Oh, my God.
Yeah, that's not science. That's religion.
Oh, Freud was a combination of psychology, psychotherapy, religion, omnipotent thinking. I was invited. They don't usually reach out like that, but when I was at Harvard, they invited me to join the Psychoanalytic Institute. And I said, as caringly as I could, that I thought it sort of was like a cult. You had to lie down on your back for 4 years, 5 times a week, go through this ritual with somebody who barely spoke to you. And I said, that's going to build ritual attachment and docility. But what I didn't anticipate is that money would totally overpower it. So as soon as the insurance companies cut them off from 5 days a week, and they discovered they could make much, much more money in an hour by basically filling prescriptions.
Yeah,
psychoanalysis
just the way
went down
that Freud
to
and
Go
his
ahead.
disciples invented complexes and drives out of thin air. Now they invent chemical imbalances out of thin air.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And the media, they go right along with it. Used to be that everybody had an Oedipus complex, and now it's everybody has a biochemical imbalance. The film industry goes along with it. It's people can be sheep Not the folks listening to this show. No sheep among you. I mean that. You're really striving to be honest and find out what's true. But oh boy, your book is a really good book. What parts of it would you like to talk about, or what would you like to progress the conversation with, Patrick?
Well, I'll tell you, listeners, a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I came to write the book. So I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or any kind of medical doctor. My training is in zoology, and I have 25 years experience teaching undergraduate courses in biology, including 5 years in Africa. And at the preposterously advanced age of 51, I took a breath and jumped, and I enrolled in the Master of Science Writing program in Johns Hopkins University here in Baltimore. And at the even more preposterously advanced age of 54, I walked across the stage and got my second master's degree. And it's been an amazing journey. And I got the idea for this book. The Templeton Foundation was offering a fellowship in genetics and human agency. And I heard about that, and I'd read your chapters in Toxic Psychiatry about the genetics of mental illness, and I knew immediately what I wanted to write about. And I didn't get fellowship, but by that time I'd already built up a full head of steam, and so this is my first book. So the book divides into three parts. The first is the history of psychiatric genetics, so that's chapters 1 through 8, beginning from the asylum era all the way up to the present day. And two themes emerge. One is there's no credible evidence for a strong genetic component to any of these conditions we call mental illness. In fact, there's overwhelming evidence that there's not a strong genetic component to these conditions. And the second is the researchers want people to believe there is, regardless of what their own data is telling them. And then part 2, so I conclude it's not in the genes, so what is causing these conditions? Is there a relationship between trauma and psychosis? And that's chapter 9, which is the longest chapter in the book. And I found there is overwhelming evidence that these conditions are caused by sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and every other category of adverse childhood experience.
Neglect. Add neglect when you give that list, because it's very important.
Yes, neglect, right, and loss of a parent,
loss,
war, being a refugee, and then that suggests, since these problems are caused on a personal and social level, maybe they could be addressed on a personal and social level. So then I go back. That's the remaining third of the book. The third part of the book, I go back to the beginning of the asylum era, and there is a rich tradition of treating these conditions with personal and social approaches, and that's been almost forgotten in the modern psychopharmaceutical era, but it's still there. The open dialogue therapy that they practice in Finland, I talked to Dr. Sakula. He's a clinical psychologist who was one of the ones who initiated this. And he told me that since this began, the incidence, first-time incidence of schizophrenia has declined in Western Lapland by 90%. Because in order to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the psychotic symptoms must last for more than 6 months. And they treat these conditions right away, and they involve the whole family, even friends, neighbors, co-workers. And so, and and they ameliorate these problems before it develops into a case of full-blown schizophrenia. And I said, so is this a cure for schizophrenia? And his reply was one word: yes. And I'm wondering, why isn't this front page headline news?
When NIMH was asked by numerous folks to fund a project for this in the United States, their response was, it wouldn't work here. It's a cultural difference.
Oh.
And now I do believe they may be helping fund one project. There's a couple of projects developing in the U.S.
Yeah, because, well, they did fund a project in the 70s, Soteria House, and Emanon, and that was a residential program for first-time cases of schizophrenia, and they were treated in a residential setting. They had lay therapists. None of them were certified psychotherapists. Some of them planned careers in psychology, and interestingly, and none of them had any history of serious mental illness, but a very high proportion of them had family members who had. And instead of considering these conditions as drug-treatable brain diseases, they regarded them as spiritual crises that the person needed to work through and integrate into his life story. And it was not a miracle cure, but what they found was that they were able to achieve outcomes at least as good as those of a well-staffed mental hospital, with minimal use of drugs, lay therapists, and no increase in cost.
I think it was less expensive, wasn't it? Hospitals
about
are very,
the same,
very
actually,
expensive.
because they were in there longer. But
that's right. They stayed longer. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but in the 19th century,
and remember, let me just interject, folks. Yeah. Some of the published papers involved cohorts with no drugs at all, and some involved some cohorts with maybe 10%, 3%. It was very minimal drug use. And the way they selected the staff was on the basis of their non-coercive empathic qualities. And I joke, and it may be true, and that's why they were all non-professionals, because professionalism tends to make you coercive and lacking in empathy. It was really a very successful program, and of course no one was going to get, or hardly anyone was going to get, tardive dyskinesia, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, chronic liver disease, brain damage, atrophy of the brain, and all these things that go along with the psychiatric drugs used to treat these conditions. So these people were much, much better off than the patients who went through the psychiatric system and stayed in it. Was there any data on whether these people, how many of these people ended up back into psychiatry or back into Soteria House? I don't remember follow-ups of that.
Yeah, any kind of long-term follow-ups? No, I didn't find anything. But there's a long tradition of that in the 19th century in the asylums. People, some of them were brought there in chains, and they got better and went home and got on with their lives. Now, it wasn't quick. I mean, it might take a year or two. And one thing I noted reading the history of some of these early asylum doctors is that a lot of them stressed the importance of keeping the patient's family away from them. They never said why, but a lot of them, including Rael, who coined the term psychiatry, stressed the importance of keeping the patient's family away from them. And they got better and went home. And what other branch of medicine have outcomes gotten now? They go in, they have shorter stays, but then this very often turns into a revolving door hospitalization, drugging, release, rehospitalization, more drugging. In what other branch of medicine have outcomes gotten worse since the 19th century?
Yeah, psychiatry is not a science, and it's really not appropriately a medical specialty. I think it would be better maybe if we had a sort of medical psychologists where they knew about medicine but treated psychologically, which is somewhat what I am like in many ways. I know medicine. I use my knowledge. I help people come off drugs, but I treat psychologically. The thing about keeping the family out, which I hadn't thought about, you're always stimulating to have on, is they probably recognize the harmful effects that often families are very disturbed, because these were very disturbed people going to these asylums. They were as disturbed as anybody's seen in psychiatry today. And they didn't have the tools, I think, then to understand how if you worked with a family, how if you helped a family, it could make such marked improvement. And they would have been even more successful if they'd been doing family work, I believe, very strongly from my own experience. I always, whenever I can, the more disturbed the patient, the more I want to try to reverse the negative influences in the family and help them become positive, because these people are often so in such bad shape, in part due to the drugs that they can't they can't manage on their own. The drugs are a big handicap in recovery, a very big. But what they replaced the family with was first Christianity. These places were very oriented around Quakers in particular, for many of the places. They treated the people as children of God. They encouraged moral influence. They surrounded the people in the institutions with other caring people. One of the books by one of the, I think it was the son of the original Tuke, who was named Tuke. I have a book by his son, a very old book, and he talks about teaching all the aides to be non-coercive and caring and gentle in a way that I don't know of any books right now for aides, for the people who assist and do most of the work, or the nurses. I don't know any books like this that is teaching them this. I mean, there are people who have books on nonviolent communication, which is very similar to this, but they're not incorporated into mental hospital training programs by and large. The police learned it and other people. So they had really an advanced idea about creating loving, moral relationships and using principles of Christianity to give the people hope. These were not punitive Christians. These were loving Christians. And I think that's very important. Is that your impression too, Patrick?
Yes. They found they responded, most of the violent patients responded to a kind and somewhat low tone of voice. And they didn't try to argue with them about their delusions and hallucinations. And that's so important. A lot of these places emphasized healthy diet.
Yes.
The Ernst Horn, the psychiatric superintendent in Berlin's charity hospital, this was 200 years ago. He asked for more appropriations to provide better food for the patients, and the bureaucrats told him the kitchen is not a drugstore. And I wonder if you think that's been neglected, the role of sound diet, the role of diet in
that is
creating or
neglected
ameliorating
everywhere in medicine. I mean, it's very hard in a modern hospital to get a decent diet. And a decent diet, to me, I mean, we know what works. We know that the more meat you eat, the worse it's going to be medically, and the more basic vegetables, not processed foods you eat, the better you're going to do. And that dairy and oils, which are all pure fat, oils are, the dairy and oils are not good for you. And the diet I eat, which is really helping me at my advanced age, you called your advanced age in the 40s and 50s. Well, I'm 83. At my advanced age, I eat much more vegetables than I used to and much more unprocessed food. I eat a little bit of meat, and I eat no dairy, zero, and I avoid the oils, the heavy oils, the 100% oils. And it's made huge difference. I no longer have, and my wife too, I no longer had diseases that I had 3 years ago.
Oh, huh?
It's a dramatic thing, that changing diet. Now, I don't know what they thought of as a good diet. I don't remember reading anywhere in their books or in descriptions of them, but probably you'd expect it to have a lot of vegetables in it. These places were out in the country. I bet anything they had.
Provide fresh fruit and vegetables for the patients.
That would be my thinking. And they specifically didn't like medical doctors, by and large. I mean, they talked about, at least some places, to protecting the patients from the doctors, and they specifically said, and their remedies, their drugs back then, and they specifically set up the Quaker retreats in part because they wanted to keep the people away from the medical docs, and they wanted to treat their fellow Quakers in a more loving and kind way, and a religious way. But Quakers are not the most doctrinaire people in the world. They are not folks who, to this day, are likely to try to impose their orthodoxy on each other. I mean, and their basic principles are so around God, a loving God, and having a God within yourself, that that they just provide inspiration. I've read some fair amount of Quakers in the past, and I love what they have to say.
And I found a lot of these medical superintendents of these institutions, of course, they were men of their day, and they tried the remedies of their day: blistering, cathartics, bleeding, emetics, so forth, purging. And they realized this isn't working. And what does work is time, kindness, rest, recreation, and the company of their fellow patients and the staff. Some of these asylums, the staff and the patients ate dinner together. I don't think they do that anymore.
No, it's Martin Buber profoundly influenced me with his book I and Thou. And he distinguished between, me and you, and you're the other, and tried to explain what it meant to have an I-thou relationship. And I think that kind of thinking, I don't know if it had been expressed that way, because Buber's was 20th century, but I think this is profoundly important. I view doing psychotherapy as a sacred a process, that it's a trust I'm given, that it's an incredible trust, that it's only been given to priests in the past, and we get to talk more openly with the people who come to us than I'm sure people mostly talk to priests. It's a real sacred trust, and rip out this idea of your patients coming to doctors and I know and you don't. It's the opposite of the I-thou. It's the I know and you don't. But diet's very bad now in medicine, although more and more doctors are kind of agreeing when I chat with them, my own doctors, the people who treat my family, people I meet. They're more and more acknowledging that eating better, eating less meat, and less dairy, and I say no dairy, and eating more vegetables unprocessed is the key to life, a healthy life. They kind of know it, they just don't know what to do about it. and in sympathy with them. Most of their patients don't want to hear it. But it is changing. It's definitely changing out there in that regard, but way behind.
And this tradition of moral therapy was continued in the 20th century by Frida Fromm-Reichmann, who we mentioned, and I devoted a whole chapter to her, and she treated people diagnosed with schizophrenia with psychotherapy. And these were not the worried well. These were patients who would masturbate or urinate openly on the ward, smear their feces on the walls, climb out on a ledge and threaten to jump. And she treated them with talk therapy, and many of these patients got well, went home, got on with their lives. Now, this didn't come cheaply. I mean, she gave them like an hour of psychotherapy a day, week after week, sometimes for years. And one of the ironies of working at Chestnut Lodge was the patients and the staff who worked there knew that if they or their loved ones had ever needed the services of the lodge, they never could afford them.
Right.
But they showed the way, and if we're not going to make that kind of and every person that they cured was one more life rescued from a lifetime of dependency. These were people who probably in any other place would have just spent the rest of their lives on the back ward of a mental hospital. And so they showed it could be done. And as a society, if we're not going to make that investment in people, let's at least go into this with our eyes wide open and say what we're doing. That not say it can't be done, because even some of the most intractable cases got better and went home. And, of course, her most famous case was Joanne Greenberg, and she was the author of the semi-autobiographical novel, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And she went on, and she married and had 2 children, became a professor, wrote many books, and where is it in the? Let's see. I've got this right here.
What are you looking for?
Oh, her afterword to the I Never Promised You a Rose Garden.
Oh, okay. Let me go to another subject.
Yeah.
Would you help me distinguish between the asylums you're talking about with medical superintendents and the havens of what I think is the genuine moral therapy era that were run usually by Christian superintendents and not with very small roles, if any, for doctors? You're referring to, I think, the reform of some of the mental hospitals versus the havens, or am I mistaken?
Well, I didn't see much difference. The retreat at York is the one you're talking about that was run by the Quakers. But they did similar things in mental hospitals in America, in Germany, in France. And, of course, there were no psychiatric drugs then, and they had...
Well, that's not true. That's not true. They have had lots of poisons. My colleagues have always had lots of poisons to give to people. So there were drugs. And, you know, there was morphine. They were using morphine when it became available a lot. They used various drugs that, had atropine-like effects. They used various poisons at times, arsenic or other poisons in, quote, small doses. I don't think there are small doses of that. So there were always neurotoxins, and they, including, because specifically they were rejecting these drugs. The Tuke family rejected the use of these drugs. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, here it is, St. Luke's Hospital for Lunatics, and that was established in 1751. and by William Batty, and he was a medical doctor. And he employed the remedies of the days, and he found they didn't work. And he found what did work was cleanliness, fresh air, rest, quiet, plain food, exercise. And again, he stressed the importance of keeping the patient's family away from them. This was in the 18th century. And Pinel in France,
I don't think he got very far. My impression is his contribution to humanity has been vastly exaggerated by conventional psychiatry, taking the chains off and stuff like that. Do you have a better impression of him than I do?
Yeah, and again, he was trained as a medical doctor, and he tried the somatic therapies, but he found he decided they didn't do much good, and what worked was kindness, empathy, and authoritative yet reassuring manner. And the same themes.
Well, I don't want to slow us down too much.
Yeah. So
your book is full of many different interesting things. I'd like to, I don't usually make appointments on the air, but I'd like to have you back again, and we can talk more about so many of these things. We haven't touched on genetics in Nazi Germany, which you talk about. We haven't really gotten too deeply into some of the other, advances in therapy. We haven't gotten to talk about Ernst Rudin, Hitler's psychiatrist. I think all these things would be interesting. Franz Kalman, who was who became our big genetic psychiatrist here, and who more extreme than the Nazi. He literally was more extreme than the Nazis.
Well, in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, these institutions became dumping grounds for mentally retarded, people with dementia, criminals, vagrants, orphans, the whole spectrum of the downtrodden and despised. And that's because of the Industrial Revolution, the migration of large numbers of people to the cities, and the decline of the multi-generational households that used to care for these people.
Right.
But, try to imagine how this must have looked to the asylum doctors. They were faced with what must have looked like them, with this growing flood tide of the dregs of humanity. And that was the genesis of the eugenics movement.
That was a part of it, yes. I think another part of the genesis is racism. Mm-hmm. A lot of it comes right out of colonial racism, as well as out of this other arena. Psychiatry has a lot of resemblance to racism, but the people they're identifying are not so much by race as, originally by poverty. I mean, the people who were, and abandonment, the people who flooded these original state mental hospitals were poor. They were the people who flooded, as you said, into the cities. They were like street people. They were street people. It was a street cleaning process for people who had no homes, no one to support them, no place to go, no way to earn a living. They might be chronically ill. They might be crazy as well. But that didn't matter. You could get thrown in these places for being destitute. And originally they were mixed with the poorhouses, and then they became the state mental hospitals separate from the poorhouses. They had to make a separation in many cases because they were the same. And when I was volunteering in a state mental hospital in the 50s, mm-hmm. The main characteristics of the people in the hospital were not so much racially determined, interestingly. It was poverty. But there were more African Americans and there were more poor people, and women. So there's an aspect of the prejudice against women as well, and old people. You know, it was like your potpourri of people being treated miserably by other people in the Western world. I've never put it so graphically. That's what these hospitals were. They were the big melting pot of all the people who were being most miserably treated by the authority of the doctors in the state mental hospital system. And I tend to be free market oriented, but there's no doubt that these were the people who did not fit into the burgeoning capitalism, and for whom we did not find a way of help. We did not find a way of helping them. Life is very complicated, very complicated.
Yeah, and people have known since time immemorial that poverty, lack of formal education, violent crime conviction rates all run in families. And from there, it's easy for people to jump to the conclusion that these traits are genetically determined.
Right.
Now, genetic determinism is not synonymous with racism, but it is the essential ingredient in racism. And racism has been thoroughly discredited in every thinking person's mind, but genetic determinism is alive and well. And then as now, it's always used to justify somebody's power over somebody else. Instead of saying somebody's from an inferior race, you say that he's born with a brain that just randomly breaks it down and has to be under the tutelage of the psychopharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. It's all about leaving behind, folks, the I-thou principle. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to achieve in America a sense that all people are equal. We work toward that. And we have a Declaration of Independence and a Bill of Rights that eventually forced an end to slavery and eventually forced an end to Jim Crow laws and official segregation. But human beings are very flawed. And anywhere you go, you're going to find these aspects of oppression. But what I believe about America, United States, is that we were founded, at least, on certain principles of liberty and equality, which have infused the world with a different viewpoint. So don't throw away the baby of America, the soul of America, with failures which afflict all societies. All societies, human beings and human societies, are never utopia. And when we try to force a utopia, we're in bad shape, according to my own sense of how the world works. I want to have you back, Patrick. We have this Patrick Hahn, H-A-H-N. The book is Madness and Genetic Determinism. It's a much broader book than its title. And I would like to come back. We could discuss this fascinating story of the Janane sisters, which I've written about in the distant past, and you're going to have new insights into, which was a family of twins who were declared by NIMH to be genetically defective because they were so disturbed. And anyone with a wit of brains reading the NIMH report would know they were all victim of a violent, sexually abusive father. This is fascinating. And this whole story was palmed off on the public as proof that since they were genetically identical, they were they were so disturbed because of that, and there's no truth at all. And another thing that I'd like to hear more about is your chapter on the Genome Project. I want to be discussing that with folks. There's more about trauma and psychosis we can talk about. So I want to hire you back, bring you back. In fact,
I'd be
I'm going to
delighted.
suggest a date so people can look forward to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So let me suggest the date of, it's going to be, here we go. How about September 11?
Okay, that sounds great.
So we're going to have you back September 11. We got 5 minutes left. What kind of additional thoughts do you have about some of the stuff we've been talking about? Anything unsaid right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you survey people in country after country and ask them, what do you think causes hallucinations, delusions, depression, anxiety? Very high on the list. They'll say, very low on the list, chemical imbalances, genes, brain malformations. Very high on the list, abuse, trauma, loss. And it's not just people in general who believe this. It's people who have these diagnostic labels and also their families. And the only people who don't believe, so in plain English, bad things happen and can drive you crazy. And the only people who don't accept this viewpoint, the only identifiable groups are 1, health professionals, and 2, the subset of families of those labeled mentally ill who join organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which, of course, as you know, is heavily funded by the drug companies.
Yes,
So,
unless they've changed their name, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. And NAMI, N-A-M-I, NAMI.
yeah.
They went after my medical license years ago.
Oh,
I don't know
wow.
if you know that, Patrick. And way back in the 80s, and I so trounced them with the huge help of my wife, Ginger, so trounced them that the government, the state had to apologize to me and beg forgiveness.
Oh, wow.
Patrick,
Good for you.
Patrick Hahn, thank you for being on the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour. We'll see you again not too long from now. And I didn't know this was your first book. Good job.
Yeah.
I had no idea this was your first book. See you again. Folks, my wonderful audience, thanks for being there. Bye-bye now.
Economic, political, and military decisions in Washington, D.C. impact the entire United States and world. And yet corporate media offers few facts, history, or people's voices about these important issues impacting our lives. I'm Esther Iverem, inviting you to check out On the Ground, Voices of Resistance from the Nation's Capital on the Progressive Radio Network, Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We cover social justice activists in the streets and in the suites. We cover those who come to D.C. from across the nation or from across the world to speak truth to power. Whether it's the war machine, the movement for black lives, healthcare, education, the economy, voting, corporate power, immigration, criminal justice, or environmental justice. Check out On the Ground, Voices of Resistance from the Nation's Capital, Monday, 6 p.m., here on the Progressive Radio Network.
Get ready for an outstanding entertainment program, The Jimmy Dore Show.
The